Before anyone knew his name, a soaked stranger walked into the restaurant looking like he might not survive another minute.
Do not let him near the tables.
Then his strength faded in the middle of lunch, and the room treated his need like something shameful to avoid. Only Naomi moved toward him, not because she was fearless, but because everyone else had chosen distance.
Somebody call emergency services now.
Naomi saw a human being where everyone else saw trouble, dirt, danger, or an interruption to their lunch.
Please, I'm sorry.
Kendra Blythe did not ask whether the man was breathing. She only saw him as a stain on her restaurant.
Stand up before you make this place look filthy.
Naomi had almost nothing left, but she spent her last money, so the stranger would not reach the hospital hungry.
Compassion is not in your job description. Take off the apron. You are done here. Use the back door. Even let her leave through the front door.
She sent Naomi into the rain like shame belonged to her. The customers who had watched Naomi kneel beside a dying man now watched her lose her job for it. Some looked away. Some looked embarrassed. Some looked relieved that the punishment had not landed on them. Only one person tried to follow her. A busboy named Isaiah, barely 19, took 2 steps forward before Kendra's stare pinned him back in place. He had 2 younger sisters and a mother on disability. Fear did what cruelty always depends on it to do. Naomi left with her apron folded in her hands, her final tip still trapped in Kendra's locked drawer, and rain soaking through her shoes by the time she reached the bus stop. That night, she told her Aunt Lottie only part of the truth. Lottie Reed was 68, though illness had aged her unevenly. Some mornings, she remembered entire hymns from childhood and the smell of Naomi's mother's perfume. Other mornings, she forgot the word for window. A stroke 3 years earlier had weakened her left side, and a slow fog had settled over her memory after that, arriving in patches that came and went without warning. Naomi had moved into the little apartment on Anson Street to care for her after Naomi's mother died of heart failure, because there had been no one else willing and no money for proper help. Naomi had once been on a different path. At 18, she had graduated near the top of her class, with a scholarship letter from a nursing program folded in a Bible on her mother's dresser. Teachers had called her steady. Counselors had called her promising. Her mother had called her the one who would break the cycle. But cycles do not break just because a letter says congratulations. Sometimes they tighten. Sometimes a hospital bill arrives. Sometimes a caregiver is needed more urgently than a dreamer. So Naomi traded lecture halls for double shifts, textbooks for order pads, and a future with clean white shoes for work shoes that pinched until her toes went numb. She did not regret caring for Lottie. Love was not the problem. The problem was that love did not pay rent, did not refill prescriptions, did not stop landlords from taping notices to doors. The problem was that people praised sacrifice from a distance, then punished the person making it for being tired. By dawn, after the longest night of her life, Naomi had calculated everything and found no answer. Without the diner, she had no paycheck. Without the paycheck, she had no rent. Without rent, Lottie could lose the only home she recognized. Naomi had prayed, but even prayer felt like it had to squeeze through a ceiling crowded with other desperate voices. Then the envelope came. It did not arrive in the mail. It did not come with a knock. It slid silently under the door just before sunrise, a pale blue rectangle against the scratched wooden floor. Naomi stared at it for several seconds before standing. Her first thought was that it might be another notice from the landlord. Her second was that she no longer had room in her chest for one more bad thing. The envelope had her name written across the front in dark ink, not printed. Written. Naomi Reed. The letters were careful, almost old-fashioned. There was no return address, only a small embossed mark in the corner. A lantern surrounded by 3 waves. Inside was not money. That almost disappointed her before she could stop herself. Inside was a single card, thick and expensive, with an address on East Bay Street and a request for her presence that morning at 9. Beneath the address was a line that made Naomi sit down before her knees could make the decision for her. It said that her act at the Mariners' table had not gone unseen. That was all. No explanation. No signature she recognized. Just that sentence, sitting in her lap like a match struck in a dark room. Naomi almost threw it away. People in trouble learn caution. Miracles, when they appear too suddenly, often come with hidden hooks. But the address belonged to the old Peabody House, a restored building near the harbor that Naomi knew only from passing it on the bus. It had once been a shipping office. Now, according to the brass plaque she had seen from the sidewalk, it belonged to something called the Lantern Harbor Foundation. She searched the name on her cracked phone. The screen loaded slowly, then showed a website full of polished photographs, food programs, mobile clinics, emergency shelters, legal aid, hurricane relief. The foundation had been started decades earlier by a shipping family that had turned old warehouse money into charity. Its current chair was a woman named Celeste Vane, known in Charleston for giving away money with one hand and guarding her privacy with the other. Naomi did not understand what any of it had to do with her. Still, at 8:30, after making sure Lottie had breakfast and leaving the neighbor with a number to call in case of trouble, Naomi put on her cleanest blouse, brushed lint from her coat, and took the bus toward East Bay Street. She carried the blue envelope in her bag like evidence in a trial no one had explained. The Peabody House looked even larger up close. Its windows were tall and arched, its brick washed clean by rain, its front steps flanked by planters full of white flowers that looked too expensive to touch. Naomi paused at the bottom step, suddenly aware of her shoes, her tired eyes, and the faint smell of diner grease still caught in her hair, no matter how carefully she had washed it. A security guard opened the door before she reached it. He did not ask whether she belonged. He said her name with respect and guided her inside. That unsettled her, more than suspicion would have. The lobby was warm and quiet. Not rich in the loud way of chandeliers and marble meant to impress, but in the deep, quiet way of places built by people who expect the world to move aside. Oil paintings lined the walls. A long table held brochures about flood relief and food access. Near the back, through a set of open doors, Naomi saw a conference room where 3 people stood waiting. One was Celeste Vane. She was in her 70s, silver-haired, straight-backed, and smaller than Naomi expected. Her face held the calm of someone who had survived more than her portrait suggested. Beside her stood a lawyer with a leather folder, and near the window, wrapped in a clean sweater, thinner but alive, was the man from the diner. Naomi stopped breathing for a moment. The man looked different without rainwater dripping from his coat. His beard had been trimmed. His skin still carried the grayness of recovery, but his eyes were clear. He was not polished. He was not suddenly transformed into someone untouched by pain, but he was alive. And when he saw Naomi, the shame in his expression changed into something more fragile and more difficult to bear: gratitude. Celeste Vane did not begin with grand speeches. She explained gently that the man Naomi had helped was named Adrian Vane, her only son. He had not been missing in the way newspapers like to describe missing heirs. His story was messier, more human, and far less convenient for gossip. Years earlier, after the death of his wife and little daughter in a highway accident, Adrian had withdrawn from the world he once helped serve. Grief had taken the shape of silence, then isolation, then a long wandering that no family money could easily fix. He had refused interviews, refused board meetings, refused even the name that tied him to wealth. For months, he had been living between shelters, ferry terminals, and hospital waiting rooms, convinced that the comfort of his family was something he no longer deserved. The Foundation had searched for him quietly. Too much publicity could have turned his suffering into entertainment. Too much pressure could have driven him farther away. On the day Naomi found him, Adrian had been trying to reach the Foundation office on foot after losing his medication and his wallet during a storm. He had made it only as far as the Mariner's table. Every person in that restaurant had seen a problem. Naomi had seen a person. Celeste made sure Naomi understood that this difference had likely saved Adrian's life. The emergency physician had said another hour in the cold rain, with his blood sugar collapsing and his body weakened, might have ended very differently. The meal Naomi paid for had arrived with the paramedics' paperwork and had become the detail that made everyone at the hospital talk, not because of its cost, but because of what it cost Naomi. Naomi felt heat rise behind her eyes. She tried to say that anyone would have done the same, but even as the thought formed, she knew it was not true. Everyone had been there. Everyone had seen him. Most had chosen distance. Celeste then did something Naomi did not expect. She did not offer a reward in the crude way people sometimes pay for conscience, as if kindness were a lost wallet returned for a fee. Instead, she asked Naomi about her life, not with pity, not with the polished curiosity of donors touring poverty for an afternoon. She asked as if Naomi's answers mattered. Naomi did not tell everything at first. Pride has its own survival instinct. But Celeste had spent decades listening to people who were tired of needing help, and she knew how to wait. Slowly, Naomi told her about Lottie, the unpaid rent, the nursing scholarship that had expired, the diner job, and the way Kendra had dismissed her in front of a room full of witnesses. She left out the most humiliating details until Adrian, from beside the window, lowered his head as though each one had landed on him personally. By the end of the meeting, Naomi's life had changed in ways she could not immediately absorb. The Lantern Harbor Foundation offered her a position coordinating a new community meals program called Harbor Hands, which would partner with local restaurants to create emergency meal vouchers for people in crisis. The salary was more than double what she had made at the diner. The benefits included home care support that could help with Lottie's medical needs. The foundation's housing attorney would contact Naomi's landlord that afternoon to stop the eviction and settle the arrears from a hardship fund, not as charity tossed from above, but as stabilization for a caregiver who had been carrying too much alone. Naomi listened with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles ached. She had expected, at most, a thank you note, perhaps a small check, perhaps nothing she could rely on. She had not expected an opening. She had not expected someone to look at her years of sacrifice and see qualifications instead of weakness. Celeste explained that the foundation did not need someone who merely understood policy. It needed someone who understood hunger without making hungry people feel small. It needed someone who knew the difference between feeding a person and humiliating them. It needed someone who had proven, under pressure, that human dignity mattered even when it was inconvenient. Naomi accepted. But stories like Naomi's do not end the moment good news arrives. In real life, blessings often disturb the people who benefited from your struggle. And Kendra Blythe had built too much of her little kingdom on Naomi, staying silent, poor, and disposable to accept Naomi's rise quietly. At first, Kendra only heard rumors. A delivery driver mentioned that the waitress she had fired had been seen entering the Peabody house. A former customer called the restaurant, asking whether it was true that the woman who helped the collapsed man now worked for the Lantern Harbor Foundation. Isaiah, trying and failing to hide his smile, told another server that Naomi's rent had been handled and her aunt would get medical support. By closing time, Kendra was no longer angry. She was afraid. Fear is different in people who are used to having power. It does not make them humble. It makes them dangerous. Kendra knew things the staff did not. She knew that for nearly 2 years, she had been skimming from the cash drawer in small amounts that looked like counting errors. She knew she had been marking donated community meals as served, then pocketing the reimbursement money when the owner was away. She knew she had refused hungry people at the door while reporting that the restaurant had participated in local relief efforts. She knew the jar labeled Storm Meal Fund had been emptied by her hand more than once. Its coins and bills treated as a private bonus for the trouble of pretending to care. She also knew Naomi had noticed irregularities. Naomi had never accused her. Naomi had been too busy surviving, but she had asked questions. She had once wondered why a church group's prepaid meal vouchers were missing from the drawer. She had once found a voided receipt under the printer with Kendra's manager code on it. She had once given a free bowl of gumbo to a veteran after Kendra claimed the voucher program had ended, only for Naomi to discover the next week that the program was still active. At the time, Kendra had dismissed the questions as confusion. Now she saw them as threats. By the next morning, Kendra had created a new story. According to her, Naomi had not been fired for helping a stranger. Naomi had been fired after an internal review suggested she had stolen money from the register and used a medical emergency to distract from it. Kendra did not make the accusation loudly at first. She was too strategic. She let it leak in pieces, through staff whispers, through a carefully worded email to the restaurant owner, through a complaint sent to the Lantern Harbor Foundation's general inbox. The complaint claimed that Naomi Reed was dishonest, unstable, and unfit to handle charitable funds. To make the lie look official, Kendra pressured Isaiah to sign a witness note stating that he had seen Naomi near the drawer before cash went missing. Isaiah refused at first. He said he had seen nothing like that. But Kendra knew his schedule, his family situation, and his fear of losing the only job close enough to home. She cut his hours in half for 1 week, then returned them with a warning hidden behind a smile. By the second week, Isaiah signed a statement he hated himself for signing. Kendra also convinced a prep cook named Marisol to say Naomi had been upset about money. That part was technically true, which made the lie harder to fight. Naomi had been upset about money because poverty had been pressing its knee against her chest for years. Kendra twisted that human truth into motive. When the foundation received the complaint, they did what responsible organizations must do. They placed Naomi on temporary administrative leave while the matter was reviewed. Celeste herself called Naomi and made it clear that leave was not judgment, but process. Still, the word leave felt like a door closing. Naomi had held her new job for only 11 days. The apartment that had begun to feel safe became heavy again. Lottie sensed Naomi's sadness even through the fog of her memory. Some evenings, she reached for Naomi's hand without knowing exactly why. Naomi tried not to cry in front of her. She had cried enough into dishwater, enough into bus windows, enough silently behind the walk-in freezer at the diner. She was tired of tears that changed nothing. What hurt most was not even the risk of losing the job. It was the precision of the lie. Kendra had chosen the accusation that would wound Naomi deepest because Naomi had spent her whole life guarding her integrity. Poor people learned that one mistake can become their whole identity. In the mouths of people looking for reasons to dismiss them, Naomi had always kept receipts, counted change twice, returned overpayments, corrected tips when customers wrote too much by accident. She knew how quickly a black woman in a service uniform could be called dishonest by someone whose own theft wore perfume and a manager badge. For 3 days, Naomi heard nothing. During those 3 days, Kendra enjoyed herself. She moved through the mariner's table with renewed sharpness, telling staff that consequences were finally catching up with people who played saint for attention. She pretended not to care when customers asked about Naomi, then made sure they received a version of events muddy enough to stain her. She even printed a new policy about employee conduct during emergencies, as if compassion had been a workplace hazard. But lies require maintenance. Truth can sit quietly and wait. The first crack came from Isaiah. Guilt can make a room feel too small. Isaiah stopped sleeping. He replayed the moment Naomi knelt beside Adrian, the way she had held his hand without flinching, the way everyone else, including him, had stood back. He replayed the moment Kendra pushed the witness note toward him and reminded him how many people wanted his job. He thought about his sisters, yes, but he also thought about what kind of man he was becoming if fear could make him harm the one person who had always treated him like he mattered. On the 4th morning, Isaiah went to the foundation office before his shift. He arrived shaking harder than Adrian had shaken in the diner, carrying a folded copy of the statement he had signed. He told the foundation's review attorney that it was false. He admitted Kendra had pressured him. He admitted he had never seen Naomi steal anything. He admitted something else, too. For months, he had watched Kendra remove cash from the store meal fund jar and replace donation vouchers with blank slips. That confession did not clear Naomi immediately, but it shifted the room. The second crack came from Marisol. She had been quiet for years because she needed work, and because Kendra had a way of making every immigrant employee feel one document away from disaster, whether that was true or not. Marisol had signed nothing, but she had allowed Kendra to use her name in the complaint. When she learned Isaiah had gone to the foundation, she did not want him standing alone. She brought what Kendra had forgotten existed: photographs. Months earlier, Marisol had photographed several prep lists and reimbursement sheets because Kendra kept blaming kitchen staff for missing voucher meals. At the time, Marisol had only wanted proof that the kitchen had prepared what it was told to prepare. But the photos showed a pattern. On days when the restaurant claimed to have served 20 donated meals, the kitchen had prepared 6. On days when reimbursement forms showed full distribution, staff meal logs showed no matching plates. Several forms had Kendra's manager code. Some had Naomi's initials forged badly enough that anyone who knew her handwriting could see the insult. The third crack came from Adrian. Recovery had not made him suddenly powerful in the way people imagine wealth fixes everything. He was still grieving. He still moved carefully through rooms. He still carried guilt like a second spine. But he had one thing Kendra had not counted on: memory sharpened by humiliation. Adrian remembered the man in the navy suit recording him when he fell. He remembered the angle of the phone. He remembered the table. He remembered the woman at the register who had complained about the interruption while filming half the room. The Foundation's attorney tracked the video after a younger staff member found a clipped version online, posted without context, under a caption mocking the stranger on the floor. The internet, for all its cruelty, sometimes preserves what liars hope will disappear. The clipped version showed Naomi kneeling. It showed customers backing away. It showed Kendra standing with folded arms. But it did not show the register clearly. The Foundation needed more. The restaurant's internal cameras, according to Kendra, had malfunctioned that day. The owner, Mr. Harlan Cho, was told the system had overwritten the footage. That should have ended the matter. It did not. Mr. Cho had inherited the mariner's table from his father, who had opened it after serving as a Navy cook. Harlan was not a cruel man, but he was an absent one. And absence in leadership often becomes permission for someone worse to take over. He had trusted Kendra because she kept the restaurant profitable and problems quiet. He had ignored small complaints because he was tired, overextended, and grieving his own divorce. When the Lantern Harbor Foundation contacted him directly, he expected a misunderstanding. Instead, he discovered that his security system had not failed. Kendra had disabled the local storage, but she had forgotten about the backup connected to the insurance provider after a break-in the previous year. The footage wasn't on the restaurant computer. It was in a secure archive she did not know how to erase. Harlan watched it alone first. He watched Naomi serving tables during the rush. He watched Adrian enter, soaked and unsteady. He watched the room recoil. He watched Naomi kneel while Kendra stood back. He watched Naomi ask for emergency help. He watched her pay at the register with her own debit card, not remove money from it. He watched Kendra take Naomi's apron and send her out the side door. Then Harlan kept watching. The archive held more than that day. It held weeks. It held Kendra opening the donation jar after closing. It held her removing envelopes from the voucher drawer. It held her entering manager codes during cash outs, voiding meals that had been paid for by community partners, and slipping bills into the side pocket of her blazer. It held her handing Isaiah the witness note in the storage hallway, pointing toward the schedule board, and making the threat clear even without audio. The truth had not needed to shout. It had needed someone to look. When Naomi was called back to the Foundation office, she expected another question, another form, another polite expression from people deciding whether to believe her. Instead, she found Celeste, Adrian, Harlan Cho, Isaiah, Marisol, and the Foundation attorney seated around the same conference table where hope had first begun to feel possible. Naomi stood at the doorway, uncertain whether she had entered a trial or a rescue. Celeste did not make her wait. She explained that the accusations had been withdrawn, disproven, and referred for further action. Harlan apologized, with a face so pale, it seemed the shame had drained him. He admitted that his trust in Kendra had allowed harm to grow under his roof. Isaiah cried before he could finish his apology. Marisol kept her eyes lowered until Naomi crossed the room and touched her shoulder. Not because Naomi owed anyone comfort, but because she understood what fear could do to good people trapped under bad authority. Adrian said the least, but his presence said enough. He had been the man on the floor. Now he was one of the reasons the truth was standing. Naomi was cleared fully. Her leave was ended. Her name was restored. But restoration, for someone who has been publicly humiliated, is not simply a letter saying the matter is closed. A lie travels through people. It enters rooms before you do. It sits in the air, waiting to see whether you will defend yourself or shrink. Celeste understood that. So did Harlan. The Mariners' Table held a staff meeting the following Monday before opening. This time, Naomi did not enter through the side door. She entered through the front. The same bell rang above her head, bright and careless, just as it had the day Adrian collapsed. But the room felt different now. The chairs were stacked on tables. The floor smelled of lemon cleaner. The staff stood near the counter, tense and quiet. Kendra was there too, though no longer behind the host stand. Her makeup was perfect, but her face had lost the confidence that once made people step aside. Harlan spoke first, not with the polished language of corporate apologies, but with the rough honesty of a man who had finally looked at what his neglect had cost. He told the staff that Naomi Reed had been wrongfully fired, falsely accused, and publicly mistreated for doing what every decent person in that room should have done. He confirmed that Kendra Blythe had been terminated for cause, and that evidence of theft, intimidation, falsification of records, and charity fraud had been turned over to the proper authorities. Kendra tried to hold herself stiff, as if posture could substitute for innocence. But there are moments when a person's own silence becomes a confession. She had spent years making others feel small under fluorescent lights. Now she stood under the same lights, while the room learned what she had done. The poetic justice was not loud, it was precise. Kendra had fired Naomi for feeding a hungry stranger, and now the theft that destroyed her reputation came from money meant to feed hungry strangers. She had accused Naomi of stealing from a register, and the register logs exposed her. She had used employees' fear to create false statements, and those same employees became the witnesses who helped undo her. She had sent Naomi through the side door in shame, and Naomi returned through the front, while Kendra left, escorted by the owner she had deceived. No one applauded. It was better that way. Applause might have made it feel like a performance. This was not a performance. It was accountability. Kendra's downfall did not end at the sidewalk. Investigators later found that the stolen voucher funds were larger than anyone first believed. Several small churches had paid the Mariners' Table in advance to provide hot meals during storms, believing their donations had reached people who needed them. Some had not. A veterans group had sponsored meal cards that were quietly canceled in the system. A neighborhood relief fund had been billed for plates never served. Kendra had not merely stolen cash. She had stolen trust from people who gave what little they had to help others. The charges that followed did not make Naomi happy. She was not the kind of person who found joy in someone else's ruin. But she did feel something steadier than happiness. She felt the weight of a foot lifting from her neck. She felt the world, for once, refusing to ask the wounded person to be the only one who pays. Kendra tried to find another management job, but Charleston is smaller than pride imagines. People talk, records travel, references matter. The same polished confidence that once opened doors now raised questions she could not answer. For the first time in years, Kendra had to live without the protection of a title, and without people beneath her to blame. Naomi returned to the Lantern Harbor Foundation the next day, not as a woman rescued by luck, but as someone beginning the work she had been preparing for her whole life without knowing it. Harbor Hand started small. At first, It was only a list of 5 restaurants willing to keep emergency meal cards behind the counter. The cards were simple, with no public label that could embarrass the person using them. A church, a shelter nurse, a bus driver, or a school counselor could request one. The meal would be served without questions, without a speech, without making hunger prove itself worthy. Naomi insisted on that. Hunger had already humiliated people enough. She built the program from memory as much as training. She remembered the mother counting coins under the table. She remembered the veteran turned away over a missing voucher. She remembered Adrian's hand trembling on a cold tile floor while strangers measured whether he deserved to be touched. She remembered all the people she had served at the Mariners' table who were one bad week away from becoming invisible. Her first major policy was called the warm seat rule. Any participating restaurant that accepted foundation funds had to agree that a person in crisis could sit inside safely while waiting for help, even if they could not order immediately. No one would be forced back into rain because discomfort was bad for business. No one would be treated like a threat for needing warmth. Some restaurant owners resisted. They worried about image, customer complaints, and liability. Naomi listened. Then she told them, calmly and without accusation, that a business afraid of being seen helping hungry people was not actually afraid of liability. It was afraid of being reminded what community means. A surprising number signed after that. The Mariners' table became one of the first official partners. Harlan Cho did more than sign. He changed the restaurant. He installed transparent accounting for every donated meal. He created a staff emergency fund. He hired an outside manager with nonprofit experience. He raised wages modestly but meaningfully, because guilt without structural change is only emotion wearing a better suit. He also placed a small brass plaque near the entrance, not with Naomi's face or a dramatic version of the story, but with a simple line that said every person who entered hungry deserved to leave treated as human. Naomi did not ask for the plaque. At first, she did not even like it. She worried it made her one act of kindness seem exceptional when she believed it should have been ordinary. But Celeste told her that reminders were necessary because decency often disappears not from one grand act of evil, but from 100 small permissions to look away. Adrian slowly returned to himself, though not to the man he had been before tragedy. Some losses do not give back the original version of a person. They make something quieter, deeper, sometimes more compassionate, sometimes more fragile. He began volunteering with Harbor Hands, first behind the scenes, reviewing supply lists and helping design intake forms that did not shame people. Later, he trained with peer support counselors to work with people in grief, addiction recovery, and housing instability. He did not pretend his family name had saved him. In fact, he understood more clearly than anyone that it almost had not. Money had searched for him, but a waitress with $38 had reached him first. That truth changed him. His relationship with Celeste healed slowly. Mother and son had spent years separated by grief, guilt, and all the words each feared would injure the other. Naomi never intruded on that healing. She only noticed, over months, that Adrian stopped standing near exits during meetings. Celeste stopped looking at him as if he might vanish if she blinked. One afternoon, Naomi saw them walk together along the harbor after a fundraiser, not speaking much, simply sharing space. Sometimes that is what forgiveness looks like before it has language. At home, life changed too. The foundation helped Naomi and Lottie move from the drafty apartment on Anson Street into a small but bright unit near a park. with an elevator, reliable heat, and a window where Lottie could watch children chasing pigeons in the afternoon. The first night there, Lottie became agitated because the walls did not feel familiar. Naomi sat with her until the fear passed, describing each room softly, grounding her in the names of things. The next morning, Lottie woke and said the sunlight looked kind. Naomi cried in the kitchen where no one could see. For years, she had measured success in avoided disasters. Rent not late enough to evict, medicine not empty enough to panic, electricity not shut off yet, shoes not broken beyond repair. Now she had space to imagine a life not built entirely around emergencies. She enrolled in evening courses toward a community health certification, not because she needed a title to prove her worth, but because the dream she had buried at 18 still had roots. The scholarship letter from long ago remained in her Bible, creased and yellowing. She did not look at it with grief anymore. She looked at it like evidence that the girl she had been was still somewhere inside the woman she had become, not lost, only waiting. Months passed, and Harbor Hands grew. What began with 5 restaurants became 15, then 28. A mobile meal van joined the program after hurricane season, exposed neighborhoods where older residents could not reach distribution sites. School counselors started calling when students came to class, hungry after weekends. Hospital social workers requested meal cards for discharged patients who had nowhere stable to go. Bus drivers carried small information cards because they were often the first to see who was sleeping where the city pretended not to look. Naomi worked harder than she ever had at the diner, but the work no longer shrank her. There is a difference between exhaustion that empties you and exhaustion that has meaning. She still had difficult days. She still dealt with budgets, skeptical donors, broken supply chains, and people who assumed compassion could be scheduled neatly between office hours. But she also saw men who had been ignored sit down to hot stew without being watched like criminals. She saw mothers receive grocery boxes before shame could force them to choose between pride and dinner. She saw restaurant workers begin to understand that dignity was not extra service, it was the meal. The story of Naomi's firing eventually reached local news, though Celeste did everything possible to keep it from turning into spectacle. Reporters wanted a clean headline: "Poor waitress saves rich heir. Villain manager exposed. Charity triumphs." But life is rarely that clean. Naomi agreed to one interview only after insisting that the focus remain on food insecurity and worker vulnerability, not on turning her into a saint. She was not a saint. She was a woman who had been tired, broke, and scared, and had still chosen to kneel. That distinction mattered. Saints are easy to admire because people imagine they are different from the rest of us. A tired woman choosing mercy with overdue bills in her pocket is much harder to ignore because she removes the excuse that kindness belongs only to people with spare time, spare money, or spotless lives. The interview aired on a Sunday evening. Naomi watched it with Lottie, who understood pieces of it. At one point, Lottie touched the screen when Naomi appeared, then looked at the real Naomi sitting beside her and smiled with sudden recognition. For one clear moment, the fog lifted enough for pride to pass through. Lottie remembered Naomi's mother then. She remembered the hospital. She remembered the little girl who used to line up dolls and pretend to check their temperatures. She remembered enough to tell Naomi, in her own wandering way, that her mother would have been proud. Naomi held that sentence for days, But the most important moment in Naomi's new life did not happen on television. It happened almost 1 year after the firing, on another rainy Tuesday afternoon, at the reopened Mariner's Table. The restaurant was hosting the launch of an expanded Harbor Hands partnership. There were donors, city officials, restaurant workers, shelter coordinators, and a few regular customers who remembered the old days with uncomfortable clarity. The event could have become polished and empty, the kind of gathering where people discuss hunger over catered trays. Naomi refused to let that happen. Instead of speeches first, she asked everyone to sit for a meal served family style. No VIP table, no reserved corner for donors, no separation between people with checks and people with lived experience. Adrian helped serve. Harlan cleared plates. Celeste sat beside a former shelter resident who now worked as a peer navigator. The room, once divided by fear and judgment, felt almost unfamiliar in its warmth. Near the end, Naomi stood where Kendra had once fired her. She did not describe Kendra with hatred. She did not need to. Hatred would have made Kendra too central to a story that had grown beyond her. Naomi spoke instead about the floor, the actual floor of the restaurant, the tile near table 6 where Adrian had collapsed. She said that every community has a floor like that, a place where someone falls and everyone else must decide what kind of person they are. Some step back, some record, some complain about the inconvenience, and sometimes one person kneels, not because they are fearless, but because they know what it feels like to need someone. She explained that Harbor Hands existed to make kneeling less lonely. It existed so mercy would not depend on one waitress risking her job or one stranger being connected to a powerful family. It existed because people should not have to be secretly important to be treated as worth saving. That line stayed with everyone. People should not have to be secretly important to be treated as worth saving. Adrian lowered his eyes when she said it. Celeste reached for his hand. Harlan looked toward the doorway, perhaps remembering all the people his restaurant had once allowed to be turned away. Isaiah, now promoted and studying hospitality management with foundation support, wiped his face quickly and pretended he had not. Marisol smiled openly, no longer afraid of being seen. After the event, when the room had emptied and rain softened the windows, Naomi stood for a moment by table 6. The tile had been repaired, where a crack once ran through it. Most people would never know anything had happened there. That seemed right to her. Sacred places do not always announce themselves. Sometimes they hide under ordinary tables in ordinary diners, waiting for ordinary people to make choices that echo farther than they can see. Naomi thought about the blue envelope that had slid under her door before dawn. For a long time, she had believed that envelope was the beginning of her rescue. Now she understood it differently. The rescue had begun earlier, on the floor, when she refused to let the room decide a man's value for her. The envelope had only carried the news that kindness, though delayed, had found its way back. And yet, she also knew kindness did not always return with a foundation job, a new apartment, or public vindication. Sometimes kindness returns quietly. Sometimes it returns years later, through a child who remembers being fed. Sometimes it returns only as the knowledge that you did not become cruel when cruelty would have been easier. That kind of return is harder to measure, but it is real. Naomi kept the blue envelope. She framed it in her office, not because of the address or the embossed lantern, but because of the sentence inside. Her act had not gone unseen. On difficult days, when funding was short or the need felt endless, she looked at that sentence and thought of all the unseen acts happening across the city. A cashier slipping a sandwich into a bag, a bus driver waiting an extra minute for an elderly passenger, a teacher sending food home without making a child explain, a nurse warming a blanket for someone no family had come to visit, a neighbor knocking on a door before the silence became permanent. The world is held together by people who do small mercies without witnesses. But Naomi also learned that mercy must become more than a moment. It must become policy. It must become systems. It must become wages, shelters, meal programs, honest records, and leaders who do not leave vulnerable workers at the mercy of petty tyrants. One good person can save a life. A good community can stop that life from falling so far in the first place. Years later, when people asked Naomi why she helped Adrian that day, they expected a dramatic answer. They expected her to say she sensed he was important, or that fate whispered to her, or that she had some grand vision of what would follow. She always disappointed them gently. She explained that she had no idea who he was. She did not see a foundation heir, a lost son, or a future partner in a citywide program. She saw a man on the floor. That was enough. And maybe that is the part of the story worth carrying with us. Not the envelope, not the money, not the downfall of a cruel manager, satisfying as justice may be. The heart of the story is the moment before reward exists, before witnesses understand, before the world claps, before anyone promises that goodness will be repaid. It is the moment when helping costs something. Naomi lost her job in that moment. She spent the last of her money in that moment. She was humiliated in that moment, but she kept something Kendra could never steal, even with false statements and forged records. She kept the kind of dignity that does not depend on a title. She kept the kind of courage that survives poverty, grief, and exhaustion. She kept the part of herself that still believed a stranger's life was worth bending down for. Kendra, in the end, lost everything she had tried to protect by refusing to bend. She protected the restaurant's image and destroyed her own. She guarded the cash drawer and exposed her theft. She treated compassion as weakness and discovered too late that compassion had witnesses stronger than fear. That is how justice sometimes works. Not always quickly, not always loudly, but with a patience that follows every hidden thing to its door. So the next time you see someone fall, maybe not on a restaurant floor, maybe not in a way anyone else can see, remember Naomi Reed. Remember the room that stepped back. Remember the woman who knelt. Remember that a person does not become worthy of kindness because they are secretly rich, secretly connected, or secretly important. They are worthy because they are human. And if you believe the world still needs people who choose mercy when no one is clapping, carry that belief into the next ordinary moment. Because somewhere, in a diner, on a bus, in a hospital hallway, under a leaking roof, someone is waiting to find out whether the room will turn away or whether one person will remember what humanity is supposed to look like.
I kept this house standing for 20 years because I believe my boys mind their way back.
She had nothing left to fight with.
There is nothing left to sell, no one left to call, and no way left to fight them.
Then 3 black cars stopped outside her gate.
She spent 20 years losing everything because of our family's lies. No one takes her home today.
3 men walked toward the house. She
Our
never
grandfather
left.
took us away from her when we were children, then made us believe she had forgotten us. We came back because she deserves the truth. This was in my hand when I was 8 years old. She carried me through floodwater because I could not breathe, and she never let go of me.
Celeste recognized it before she recognized
I
him.
know that flashlight, but that little boy was only 8 years old. Who are you?
They were not sent by the bank.
The bank did not send us. I am Owen, and we found every letter you wrote after they took us away from you.
They brought 73 hidden letters.
There were 73 letters hidden in our grandfather's private study. Birthday cards, Christmas you sent us was kept from us.
Every letter proved she never stopped loving them.
I wrote to all three of you, every birthmas, every time it stormed.
The brothers had believed she abandoned them.
We were children, and they told us you had moved on without us. For 20 years, I thought you had let us go because we were too difficult to love.
But their grandfather
never left us.
had stolen the truth.
He lied to us because he thought money could replace the woman who made us feel safe for the first time. We found every letter you ever sent us hidden in our grandfather's private study. For 20 years, he made us believe you abandoned us, and he made you believe we forgot you.
To understand why those letters mattered so much, it was necessary to go back to the winter of 2004, when Celeste Morgan was 46 years old and had almost convinced herself that God had forgotten the prayer she had whispered for half her life. Celeste lived in a small, weathered house near the edge of Pine Hollow, Tennessee, where the road narrowed into old trees and rusted mailboxes. The house had belonged to her Aunt Evelyn, a woman who believed that every home should keep a light burning near the front door in case someone needed help after dark. Evelyn had been gone for years, but Celeste kept the habit. No matter how tired she was, no matter how high the electric bill became, the porch light always came on at sunset. Celeste worked before sunrise in the laundry department at Pine Hollow Memorial Hospital. Most people never saw her there. They only saw clean sheets folded in perfect stacks, fresh towels delivered to rooms, and uniforms pressed before the next shift began. At night, she cleaned the county archive building, where old records slept beneath dust and locked glass cabinets. Her days were long, her income was small, and her hands were always dry from soap and bleach. Still, Celeste gave what she could. She brought extra food to the church pantry. She volunteered twice a month at a weekend program for children waiting to be placed in foster homes. She kept a box of winter coats in her hallway closet. Most of them donated. Some bought one at a time from thrift stores after payday. The children who came through the program knew her as the woman who remembered their favorite snacks, who never forced them to speak before they were ready, and who understood that a child could be loud, rude, withdrawn, or angry without being bad. Years earlier, Celeste had lost 2 pregnancies. The second loss had nearly taken her life. After that, doctors told her that another pregnancy would be too dangerous. She had spent months grieving a future that no longer seemed possible, then years learning to live with the empty space it left behind. But she never stopped wanting to be a mother. She simply stopped saying it out loud. One rainy evening in November, after 2 exhausting shifts and a bus ride home, Celeste unlocked her front door and found a message blinking on her answering machine. It was from Cassandra Reed, a social worker who had known Celeste through the weekend foster program. Cassandra had a problem that could not wait until morning. 3 brothers had lost both parents in a highway accident several weeks earlier. Their father, Daniel Vale, had been driving home with his wife after visiting family in another county when a delivery truck crossed the center line during a storm. Daniel and his wife died at the scene. Their son survived because they were asleep in the back seat. The oldest boy was 14-year-old Owen. The middle brother, Mateo, was 11. The youngest, Silas, was 8. In the weeks after the funeral, the boys had been moved from emergency placement to emergency placement. One family agreed to take Owen, but not the younger 2. Another said Mateo was too angry. A third said Silas's silence made them uncomfortable. The brothers had already begun to understand a terrible truth. People were willing to help them only if helping did not cost too much. The state was preparing to separate them. Cassandra knew Celeste's home was small. She knew Celeste did not have much money. She also knew Celeste had completed emergency caregiver training, passed the required background checks, and had been waiting for a placement that needed someone willing to care for children who had already learned not to trust promises. Celeste called Cassandra back before taking off her coat. By midnight, she had cleared the guest room, spread blankets across the old sofa, and pulled every extra pillow from the linen closet. She cooked a pot of chicken soup, though she had no idea whether any of the boys would eat it. Then she turned on the porch light and waited. The boys arrived after 1 in the morning. Owen entered first. He was tall for his age, thin in the way children become thin when stress replaces appetite, and he carried a backpack that looked too small to contain a life. Mateo followed with his hands clenched inside the sleeves of an oversized hoodie. Silas came last, holding a plastic grocery bag filled with folded paper stars. Celeste noticed immediately that none of them looked around the house with curiosity. They looked around it like prisoners measuring a cell. They had learned not to get comfortable. Celeste did not ask them to call her anything. She did not tell them everything would be fine. She did not ask them to smile for the social worker or say thank you for the soup. She simply told them there was food in the kitchen, clean blankets in the bedrooms, and enough room for all 3 of them to stay together. That first night, Owen slept in his clothes with his backpack under his arm. Mateo refused to eat until nearly 3 in the morning, when he thought nobody was watching. Silas sat by the window, folding and unfolding the same paper star until the corners tore. Celeste did not force him to stop. The first weeks were difficult in ways that no foster training manual could fully explain. Owen hid food under his bed. Bread, crackers, fruit cups, even half a sandwich wrapped in a napkin. At first, Celeste found it and almost scolded him. Then she remembered something she had heard from another foster parent years earlier. Children who have been moved too often do not hoard food because they are greedy. They hoard it because they do not believe breakfast is guaranteed. So Celeste placed a small basket in the pantry and told the boys it belonged to them. It was always stocked with crackers, fruit, cereal bars, and anything else she could afford. Nobody had to ask permission to take from it. Nobody had to hide it. Owen did not trust the basket at first. But after several weeks, the food under his bed began to disappear. Mateo struggled differently. He carried his grief like a match held too close to gasoline. A wrong look at school could set him off. A careless joke about his parents could make him swing before he had time to think. He had been suspended twice before Christmas, and once after, not because he enjoyed hurting people, but because anger was the only feeling he knew how to express without falling apart. Celeste did not excuse what he did, but she refused to define him by it. She introduced him to George Bell, a retired firefighter who ran a small woodworking program for boys at the community center. George had lost a son in the military years earlier and understood the language of grief that came out through broken things. At the workshop, Mateo learned to sand rough edges until they became smooth. He learned to measure twice before cutting once. He learned that strength could be useful without being dangerous. The first thing he made was a crooked wooden shelf for Celeste's kitchen. She hung it anyway. Silas remained quiet. For almost 2 months, he spoke only with his eyes, his hands, and the paper stars he folded from scraps of newspaper, old schoolwork sheets, and grocery lists. He lined them on the windowsill of his room, then moved them to the dining table, then placed one beside Celeste's coffee mug each morning. She never asked what they meant. She only kept them safe. Celeste had 4 rules in her home. The first was that whenever possible, everyone ate together. The second was that nobody would be punished for telling the truth. The third was that anger could be taken outside, written down, cried out, or worked through. But it could not be used to wound someone else. The fourth rule was the most important. The porch light stayed on until everyone was home. At first, the boys thought the rule was strange. Then they began to understand it. The porch light was not only for strangers, it was for Owen when he came home late from helping George fix a broken fence. It was for Mateo after detention. It was for Silas when he woke from nightmares and needed to stand on the porch steps, looking at something warm against the darkness. It was Celeste's way of telling them that no matter how difficult the day had been, there was still a place waiting for them. For a while, Pine Hollow watched from a distance. Some people were kind. The women at the church brought casseroles. George gave Mateo spare tools. A teacher at Silas's school quietly donated books with large pictures because she had noticed he liked to trace the drawings with his fingers. The woman at the grocery store began saving bruised apples for Celeste at a discount. But not everyone approved. Mabel Crew, who ran the weekly Pine Hollow Bulletin, had spent most of her life collecting other people's mistakes and turning them into public entertainment. She was the kind of woman who claimed she only cared about the community while making sure every rumor reached the community before the truth did. Mabel began with questions that sounded harmless. She wondered aloud how a woman with 2 jobs could properly care for 3 boys. She asked why the county would place children in an old house with a leaking roof. She hinted that Celeste might be accepting foster payments for reasons that had nothing to do with love. The rumors spread because rumors always spread faster in places where people know each other's business but rarely know each other's pain. Celeste heard them. She heard the whispers in grocery store aisles. She saw the looks when she walked into church with the boys. She noticed people growing quiet when she approached, but she did not fight every lie. She was too busy building a home. By spring, Owen had started helping her repair the back fence. He had a talent for fixing things without making a fuss about it. He could look at a loose hinge, a broken drawer, or a warped board, and somehow understand what it needed. Celeste began saving small amounts from every paycheck to buy materials. Owen gave up asking why she was spending money on a house that was barely standing and began helping her make it stronger. Mateo's grades improved, not because he suddenly became interested in school, but because George taught him how to take pride in learning something difficult. He started staying after class to work on math with a teacher who had once been afraid of him. He still had a temper, but now he knew anger did not have to decide who he became. Silas spoke for the first time on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Celeste had fallen asleep in the chair after cleaning the archive building overnight. The boys were in the kitchen, making grilled cheese sandwiches with more butter than necessary. Silas stood near the counter, watching smoke rise from a pan that had been left too long on the stove. Then he said one word. He said Celeste's name. Owen dropped the spatula. Mateo froze. Celeste woke so fast that she nearly knocked over her coffee. Silas looked embarrassed, as if he had broken something by speaking. But Celeste did not rush him. She simply smiled and told him she had heard him. That was enough. The real turning point came during the flood. In late January of 2006, Pine Hollow was hit by 3 days of relentless rain. The river rose. Roads vanished under brown water. Power lines fell across backyards. The town had seen storms before, but not like this. By the 3rd night, the electricity in Celeste's house went out. The boys gathered in the living room under blankets, while rain hammered the roof. Water crept beneath the back door. The porch light flickered, dimmed, then went dark for the first time in years. Silas had always been afraid of storms after the accident that killed his parents. But that night, his fear became something worse. His breathing tightened. His chest began to rise and fall too fast. The inhaler he had been prescribed was nearly empty, and the nearest hospital was across several flooded roads. Celeste tried the phone. There was no signal. She tried her car. The engine turned once, then died. The volunteer fire station was less than a mile away, but between the house and the station was a stretch of road already covered in water. Mateo wanted to go. Owen wanted to carry Silas. Celeste knew none of them could manage it alone. So she wrapped Silas in blankets, gave Owen an old flashlight, and told Mateo to stay close behind them. Then she stepped out into the storm. The water was freezing. The wind cut through their clothes. At one point, Celeste slipped near a ditch hidden beneath the floodwater and nearly lost her footing. Owen grabbed her arm before she fell. Mateo held Silas tight against his chest, even though fear had made him shake from head to toe. They reached the fire station just before Silas's breathing became dangerously shallow. The volunteers got him to the hospital in a rescue truck. Doctors later said that the timing had mattered. Celeste spent the rest of the night sitting in a plastic chair beside Silas's hospital bed. Her shoes were still wet. Her hands were raw from cold. She had not slept in more than 20 hours. When Silas woke, he looked at her for a long time. Then he gave her a name that did not appear on any government document. He called her Mama Celeste. Not loudly, not perfectly, but clearly enough for Owen and Mateo to hear. Neither of the older boys said anything. They did not need to. From that day forward, the house on the edge of Pine Hollow was no longer a temporary placement. It was home. Owen carved a small wooden sign and hung it near the porch. It read, "The Morgan Home." Mateo built a narrow bench beneath the front window. Silas placed paper stars along the ledge, one for every night the porch light had stayed on. For the first time since their parents died, the boys began planning for the future. Owen talked about becoming a contractor. Mateo wanted to build furniture. Silas had started making little drawings of houses with yellow lights in the windows. Celeste began the paperwork to move from emergency placement to long-term guardianship. And then Alistair Vale arrived. He came in a black car with a driver, 2 attorneys, and the kind of quiet confidence that made people step aside before he asked them to. Alistair was the father of Daniel Vale, the boy's late father. He was also the founder of Vale Holdings, a regional construction company that had grown into a national corporation. For years, Alistair and Daniel had been estranged. Daniel had walked away from the family business after Alistair refused to accept the life he wanted. He had married a woman Alistair considered beneath the expectations of the Vale name. He had moved away, worked ordinary jobs, raised his sons without asking his father for money, and kept the boys far from a world built on appearances. When Daniel and his wife died, Alistair had been notified through legal channels, but at the time, he had chosen not to act. The boys were grieving. The situation was complicated, and Alistair did not want public attention around a family conflict he had spent years pretending did not exist. Then an insurance settlement connected to the accident began moving through probate court. The existence of 3 minor heirs became impossible for him to ignore. Suddenly, Alistair discovered the importance of family. He told the court that he could offer the boys stability, education, medical care, private tutors, and a financial future Celeste could never provide. His attorneys pointed to the house's old wiring, the repairs Celeste could not yet afford, and the fact that her emergency caregiver status had not been converted into permanent guardianship. They did not accuse Celeste of cruelty. They did something more devastating. They made love sound insufficient. Cassandra testified that the boys were attached to Celeste and that separating them from her could cause lasting harm. George spoke about Mateo's progress. Teachers described Owen's new confidence and Silas's return to speech. But under state rules, biological kinship carried weight, and Alistair's attorneys knew how to turn every weakness in Celeste's life into evidence that she could not compete. The judge did not say Celeste had failed. The judge said the boys would be placed with their grandfather for their future. To Celeste, the difference meant nothing. The day they left was colder than the night of the flood. Owen stood on the porch for a long time, staring at the sign he had made. Mateo kept wiping his face with the sleeve of his jacket, angry at himself for crying. Silas held the battered flashlight from the flood night against his chest. Celeste packed what the boys were allowed to bring. Most of it was not much: clothes, school books, a few photographs, Mateo's first woodworking project, some paper stars. Before leaving, Owen slipped a folded piece of paper into the kitchen drawer. Celeste did not find it until later that night. It was a map of the house, drawn in pencil. The front porch was marked with a small yellow circle. Underneath it, Owen had written that they would remember where the light was. For a while, Celeste believed that promise would be enough. It was not. Alistair moved the boys into his estate outside Nashville. He told everyone that he was giving them a better life. But better, in his world, meant controlled. Owen was sent to a private academy that taught him how to speak in rooms full of powerful men. Mateo was placed in a strict boarding school after several angry outbursts. Silas was enrolled in a program designed to make him more polished, more composed, and less emotional. They were not physically abandoned, but they were emotionally managed. Whenever the boys asked about Celeste, Alistair gave them versions of the same story. He suggested that she had moved on. He implied that she had accepted the money the state had provided and chosen not to remain involved. He told them letters had not come because there was nothing to receive. At the same time, Celeste wrote. She wrote on birthdays. She wrote at Christmas. She wrote whenever she heard that a storm had passed through Nashville and wondered whether Silas still feared thunder. She wrote to Owen about home repairs. She wrote to Mateo about the old workshop tools George had left for him. She wrote to all three boys about the porch light. The letters never arrived. Mabel Crew made things worse in Pine Hollow. After the court ruling, she wrote a carefully worded article suggesting Celeste had lost the boys because the county had concerns about her care. She never directly accused Celeste of abuse. She did not need to. She used phrases like troubling circumstances and questions about stability. In a small town, vague words could destroy a reputation more effectively than a direct lie. Celeste lost her evening cleaning job at the archive after a board member complained that the county should avoid controversy. Some parents stopped letting their children attend the weekend foster program if Celeste was there. The church pantry, where she had volunteered for years, quietly asked her to take a break. The woman who had opened her home to 3 grieving boys became someone people crossed the street to avoid. Still, every night, she turned on the porch light. Years passed. The roof was repaired one patch at a time. The garden behind the house grew wild, then was cut back, then grew again. The boys became men. Owen learned the business Alistair wanted him to learn, but he never became blind to what power could do. Mateo became a skilled furniture maker and later founded a company that hired young people leaving foster care. Silas, who had once folded paper stars in silence, became a documentary editor. He built stories from old footage, forgotten letters, and details other people missed. They stayed close to one another because they had learned early that brothers were not simply relatives. They were witnesses. As adults, they began asking harder questions about their childhood. Owen remembered the basket of food in Celeste's pantry. Mateo remembered the shelf he had built. Silas remembered the warm circle of porch light reflected in floodwater. None of those memories matched the version of Celeste that Alistair had described. When Alistair died, the brothers inherited more money than they had ever wanted, and more answers than they were prepared to face. Among the documents in his private study was a locked cabinet. The key was found in a sealed envelope addressed to the estate executor. Inside were the letters, dozens of them, some still unopened. There were also notes from Alistair's staff, records showing that correspondence had been intercepted, calls from Celeste had been blocked, and school administrators had been instructed not to share the boys' contact information with her. For 20 years, Alistair had allowed his grandsons to believe the woman who saved them had stopped caring. For 20 years, he had allowed Celeste to believe the boys had forgotten her. The brothers began searching for her immediately. But Pine Hollow had changed. Records were incomplete. Celeste had withdrawn from almost every public part of her life. Her house was still listed under an old family trust in Evelyn Morgan's name. Mabel's old articles falsely suggested Celeste had left town years earlier. Every lead seemed to end in another dead file, another wrong address, another person who remembered her only through rumor. Then, nearly 4 years later, Silas found a hospital billing record connected to an old charity program. It led them back to Pine Hollow. It led them to a foreclosure notice. And it led them to a woman sitting alone in a dark house with one suitcase by the door, believing that the last thing she had left was about to be taken from her, too. Celeste did not recognize them at first. 20 years can change a child's face so completely that memory has to search for smaller things. A way of standing. A habit of looking away when overwhelmed. A hand that turns a ring around a finger whenever anger is trying to rise. She saw Owen first in the oldest man's posture. He still carried his shoulders slightly forward, as if he were ready to shield someone smaller behind him. She saw Mateo in the way the middle brother glanced at the porch bench before looking anywhere else. And she saw Silas when the youngest man raised the battered silver flashlight and held it carefully, not as an object, but as proof that he had carried part of her with him all his life. For a moment, Celeste could not breathe. She had imagined this day so many times that reality felt almost cruel. In some versions, the boys had come back angry. In others, they had come back only long enough to explain why they had stayed away. In the saddest versions, they had never come back at all. Now they were standing in front of her, grown into men she had not been allowed to know. Owen stepped forward first. He did not begin with an excuse. He did not say that time had healed anything. He opened the briefcase and placed the letters on Celeste's kitchen table. Her hands shook when she saw her own handwriting. There were envelopes she remembered licking, closed in the middle of the night. There were stamps she had bought instead of medicine one winter because she had believed a message from a mother mattered more than comfort. There were letters she had written after cancer treatment, when she could barely hold a pen steady. There were birthday cards for boys who had become men before she was allowed to see them again. She picked up one envelope and stared at it for so long that nobody spoke. Then she looked at Owen. The grief in his face told her everything. The boys had not forgotten. They had been kept from her. The reunion did not become easy simply because the truth had been found. There were too many missing years, too many birthdays, too many first jobs, graduations, illnesses, heartbreaks, and ordinary afternoons that should have belonged to a family, but had been stolen by pride and silence. Celeste did not rush to fill that space with speeches. She made coffee. It was what she had done whenever someone came into her home carrying pain. They sat around the same kitchen table where Owen had once hidden crackers in his pockets, where Mateo had built his crooked shelf, where Silas had left paper stars beside her mug. The wood was more worn now. The chairs did not match. The room still smelled faintly of coffee, old paint, and the lemon cleaner Celeste had used for decades. Owen told her about the letters. Mateo told her about the years they had spent wondering whether she had chosen to let them go. Silas told her that he had kept the flashlight because it was the only thing from their old life that no one had managed to take from him. Celeste listened. She did not blame them. They had been children when they were taken away. Later, they had been young men trying to survive inside a family that treated obedience like gratitude. They had believed what they were told because children often believe the adults who control the doors around them. But the truth did not erase the damage. Celeste had spent 2 decades asking herself whether she had failed them. She had wondered if Owen had become ashamed of her. She had feared Mateo had turned his anger against the world because she wasn't there to help him carry it. She had imagined Silas losing his voice again, alone in some cold room far from the house where he had first begun to speak. For 20 years, she had lived with a wound that had no explanation. Now the explanation was sitting in front of her in a stack of unopened letters. Owen told her they had not come only to apologize. The bank had scheduled the house for auction because Celeste had fallen behind after years of medical bills, property taxes, and repairs. She had never complained publicly. She had sold what she could, delayed treatment when she should not have, and tried to keep the house because it was the last place in the world where she still felt connected to the boys. Owen had already paid the debt, not as a favor that would leave her feeling indebted, not as a grand gesture for cameras. He had arranged for the home to be protected through a legal trust that Celeste controlled herself. The house would remain hers. The land would remain hers. No company, bank, or relative would ever have the power to take it from her again. Mateo had brought plans to repair the roof, reinforce the foundation, rebuild the porch, and restore the garden. But he had made one thing clear from the beginning. Nothing would be changed without Celeste's approval. They were not there to turn her home into a museum of their guilt. They were there to give her back the security she should have had all along. Silas had something different. He had spent years making documentaries about people who had been overlooked by systems larger than themselves. He knew how to find the truth inside old records, erased histories, and stories that powerful people preferred to keep buried. He had spent months gathering proof of what happened in Pine Hollow. He found the court documents showing that Celeste had never been declared abusive or dangerous. He found the licensing records showing that her only obstacles had been financial and structural, not moral. He found letters from Cassandra Reed praising Celeste's care. He found statements from teachers, George Bell, hospital staff, and neighbors who remembered the boy's improvement after moving into Celeste's home. Most of all, he found Mabel Crew's old articles. The stories had been carefully written to avoid legal consequences, but their meaning had been obvious. Mabel had turned uncertainty into suspicion, and suspicion into public judgment. Her words had helped isolate Celeste at the moment she needed community most. Mabel was still in Pine Hollow. She had become older, slower, and more respected than she deserved to be. She sat on the community advisory board. She ran local heritage events. People called her a historian, though much of her work had been built on stories she never bothered to verify. Owen, Mateo, and Silas did not want revenge in the way most people imagined revenge. They did not want to humiliate Mabel for entertainment. They did not want to use their money to make her suffer. They wanted the town to face what it had done. And they wanted to create something that would prevent another family from being treated the same way. A week later, Pine Hollow held a public town meeting at the old municipal hall. The official purpose of the meeting was a redevelopment proposal. A private company had offered to buy several older properties near the edge of town, including homes once owned by low-income families. The plan promised new shops, parking spaces, and increased tax revenue. Many residents supported it because the town had struggled for years. Few people knew that Owen had purchased the development company's controlling interest months earlier. Few people knew that Mateo had spent years working with transitional housing programs for young adults, leaving foster care. Few people knew that Silas had prepared a short documentary built from old records, interviews, photographs, and the letters Alistair had hidden. The hall was full that night. Mabel sat near the front in a navy blue jacket, smiling at people who greeted her. She had no idea that the story she once helped bury was about to return. Celeste almost did not go. She had spent so many years avoiding public spaces that the thought of sitting in a crowded room made her chest tighten. She did not want pity. She did not want strangers looking at her with guilty eyes. She did not want her pain turned into a spectacle. But Silas told her, gently and without pressure, that the decision was hers. Celeste thought about the 3 boys who had once been too afraid to believe they would stay together. She thought about the younger version of herself, standing in a courtroom, while strangers discussed whether love was enough. She thought about every person who had heard a lie about her, and chosen silence, because silence was easier than asking for the truth. So she went. She wore a simple green dress she had owned for years. Owen walked beside her. Mateo carried a folder of documents. Silas held the old flashlight in one hand and a small box of paper stars in the other. The meeting began like every other meeting in Pine Hollow. The mayor spoke about investment. Council members discussed property values. Mabel made notes, as though she had already decided how the story would be told in the next edition of her bulletin. Then Owen stood. He introduced himself not as the head of Vale Holdings, but as a former foster child who had once been told that love could not compete with wealth. He explained that his company would not support the demolition plan. Instead, the Vale brothers were creating the Porch Light Foundation, a fund dedicated to keeping siblings together in foster care, supporting emergency caregivers, helping low-income families meet housing requirements, and giving young people leaving the foster system a safe place to begin again. The fund would provide grants for home repairs, medical support, legal advocacy, school supplies, counseling, and temporary housing. It would also create a local family resource center in Pine Hollow, not in a distant city where people had to drive hours to ask for help. Mateo explained that the old neighborhood would not be demolished. Several homes would be renovated and converted into short-term housing for foster families, grandparents raising grandchildren, and women rebuilding after medical or financial crises. The project would not be named after the Vale family. It would be named after the woman who taught them what home meant. Then Silas stepped forward. The room grew quiet as he placed the old flashlight on the table beside him. He explained that it had belonged to a boy who once believed nobody would come for him. He explained that the woman who carried that boy through floodwater had later been painted as unstable, selfish, and unfit by people who never bothered to learn the truth. The lights dimmed. A screen behind him came alive. For the next 12 minutes, Pine Hollow watched the story it had refused to see. They saw photographs of Celeste's house before the boys arrived. They saw a copy of her emergency caregiver certification. They saw records of Owen's improved school attendance, Mateo's workshop reports, and Silas's first documented words after months of silence. They saw court records showing that Celeste had never been accused of abuse or neglect. They saw excerpts from the letters she had written, each one filled with patience, worry, and love. They saw the false assumptions that had spread through town, repeated so often that many people had mistaken them for fact. And finally, they saw Mabel's own articles. Nobody shouted. Nobody needed to. The silence in the room was heavier than anger. Mabel sat frozen in her chair. For years, she had believed that the harm she caused was small, because she had never put her hands on anyone. She had not taken the boys away. She had not blocked the letters. She had not stood in the courtroom, but she had helped make Celeste alone. She had given people permission to look away. When the film ended, Mabel stood slowly. Her voice shook as she admitted that she had never verified the claims she printed. She had relied on gossip, on assumptions, and on the belief that a poor woman with no powerful family behind her would never have the ability to challenge her. She said that she had told herself she was protecting the community, but the truth was harder. She had enjoyed being the person who decided whose story mattered. Mabel apologized to Celeste in front of the entire town. Celeste did not rush to embrace her. She did not perform forgiveness for the comfort of people who wanted the evening to end neatly. Instead, she told Mabel that an apology was not the same as repair. Truth had to be spoken. Harm had to be acknowledged. Change had to be proven over time. The room listened. For the first time in decades, Celeste was not speaking from a place of shame. She was speaking from dignity. Mabel resigned from the Community Advisory Board the following month. She published a full correction in the Pine Hollow Bulletin, naming the false assumptions and admitting the damage they caused. She donated the profits from her local history books to the Porchlight Foundation. It did not erase the years Celeste lost, but it changed what would happen next. The town began to change in smaller ways too. The church pantry asked Celeste to return, not as a volunteer carrying boxes, but as an advisor for families in crisis. The archive building that once dismissed her offered her access to records for the foundation's work. Teachers who had remained silent when Mabel's rumors spread began supporting a school program for children in temporary housing. George Bell, now old and walking with a cane, came to the Morgan house one afternoon, carrying Mateo's first wooden shelf. He had kept it safe after Celeste lost storage space during treatment. Mateo hung it back in the kitchen himself. Owen repaired the back fence. Mateo rebuilt the porch bench. Silas framed several of the paper stars and placed them along the hallway wall. The house changed, but it did not become unfamiliar. The cracked boards were replaced. The roof no longer leaked. The heating system worked. The garden came back to life. But Celeste insisted that the old porch light remain exactly where it had always been. It was cleaned, repaired, and fitted with a new bulb. But it was still the same light. The first Thanksgiving after the brothers returned, the kitchen was too crowded. Mateo burned the rolls because he was trying to cook and argue with Owen at the same time. Owen complained about the table being too small, even though he had built an extension for it himself. Silas sat quietly for a while, watching them with the soft expression of someone who had waited too long to see a room full of people feel safe. Celeste looked around the table and understood something she had not been able to understand before. She had not failed. She had never failed them. What had happened was not proof that love had been too weak. It was proof that power could be cruel when it valued ownership over care. But even after 20 years of silence, the boys had remembered the truth of what she gave them. Not every detail, not every day, but the feeling. They remembered being wanted. They remembered being safe. They remembered the light. Months later, on another rainy evening, Celeste was sitting on the porch when Cassandra Reed's daughter came up the walkway. Cassandra herself had retired years earlier, but her daughter had followed her into social work. She was not there to ask Celeste to take in another child. Celeste was older now. She had earned the right to rest. Nobody expected her to begin again from nothing. But the young social worker had brought a 12-year-old girl named Ava, who had been moved 3 times in 6 months and was waiting for a temporary place to stay while a kinship arrangement was being reviewed. Ava stood under the porch roof with a duffel bag pressed tightly against her side. She looked at the house the way Owen, Mateo, and Silas had once looked at it. Not with hope. Not yet. With caution. Celeste did not make promises she could not keep. She simply invited Ava inside for a meal. Owen set another chair at the table. Mateo pulled a dry blanket from the closet. Silas showed Ava the paper stars in the hallway and explained, without using too many words, that they had been made by someone who once did not know how to speak. Outside, rain tapped against the porch roof. Inside, the house grew warm. And before the night was over, Celeste walked to the front door and turned on the light. Because family is not only blood. It is not money, property, a last name, or a promise written into a legal document. Family is the person who keeps a place for you when the world has convinced you that you do not belong anywhere. Family is the hand that reaches for you in floodwater. Family is the home that waits without asking whether you deserve to return. And sometimes, after years of darkness, all it takes to find your way back is one porch light that never went out. Before sunrise, Block D stood frozen for roll call. 4 years in this place, and he still thinks silence makes him untouchable.
Let's see how long that lasts.
May sensed something was wrong.
This place is too quiet. It feels like everyone is waiting for something bad.
Then she reached Caleb Monroe's name.
Caleb Monroe, this is your second call. Answer the count now.
Caleb remained silent. Ronan noticed the silence.
You hear them calling your name, Ghost. Answer them, or I will make this whole block remember why nobody ignores me.
Ronan ruled through fear.
Every man in this block has something to lose. A mother, a daughter, a parole hearing, a secret. Tell me, Caleb, what do you still have left?
Ronan humiliated him publicly.
Not a word. Not a threat. That is what happens when a man forgets he belongs to someone stronger.
Caleb gave him nothing.
You think fear makes you powerful. It only proves you are terrified of anyone who refuses to kneel.
Warden Vale arrived.
This prison survives because every man understands his place. Mr. Monroe has spent 4 years pretending he is above that rule. Write him up for defiance. Send him to laundry detail. Some lessons are easier to understand when no one is watching.
They said you hurt people who trust you. Please tell me they are lying.
That night, Mateo was found dead.
His wrists were restrained. His shoes are still on. This was not suicide. Someone made it look like one.
The officers behind Caleb heard the words, but none of them wanted to understand them. In Blackridge, truth was not measured by what a man could prove. It was measured by who had the authority to write the report. And before Mateo's body was even taken away, Caleb could already see how the lie would be built. The bruises would be called confusion. The knot would be called desperation. The shoes would be ignored entirely. By morning, Mateo Ruiz would become another official tragedy. Another inmate who could not survive his own guilt. Another name removed from the meal roster, as if he had never been more than a number. But Caleb knew better. He had seen this pattern before. A frightened prisoner became unstable on paper. A camera failed at the perfect moment. A guard forgot what he had seen, and a doctor signed faster than any honest man should. Mateo was not the first. That was the part Caleb could not say out loud. Not yet. Because inside Blackridge, speaking too soon did not save the dead. It only warned the living men who had killed them. The next morning, Mateo's cell was empty. His name had already been removed from the meal roster. His belongings were packed in a box for a family that would receive them with a letter full of words like regret and condolences. At roll call, Warden Vale paused beside Caleb. This time, Ronan Pike stood nearby with a fresh cut on his lip from an unrelated fight and an expression that suggested he was enjoying himself. Vale asked Caleb whether he had anything to say about Mateo Ruiz. Caleb looked at him. For the first time in years, every man in Block D waited for an answer. But Caleb remained silent. Vale sighed, as if disappointed by a child. Then he announced that a recording had been recovered from the previous evening. According to the recording, Caleb had threatened Mateo shortly before he died. Officer Doran felt her stomach tighten. She had listened to the audio in the security office 20 minutes earlier. The voice was distorted, low, and difficult to hear. But the report stated with confidence that it belonged to Caleb Monroe. She had never heard Caleb speak. None of the guards had, at least not in her presence. Yet Warden Vale said the evidence was conclusive. Caleb was placed in restraints and taken toward segregation. As two officers gripped his arms, he turned his head slightly toward Officer Doran. His face did not show panic. It did not show anger. But for the first time, she saw urgency in his eyes. When they passed close enough, something small touched the floor near her shoes. A folded piece of paper. She waited until the corridor was empty before picking it up. There were only 3 words written on it. Count them missing. Officer May Doran stood alone beneath the cold lights, staring at the note while the sounds of Black Ridge continued around her. Doors slammed. Men shouted from distant cells. A guard laughed somewhere down the hall. The prison moved on because prisons always moved on. But she could not stop thinking about Mateo Ruiz. She could not stop thinking about Caleb's eyes. And she could not stop thinking about the fact that the official report had called Mateo's death a suicide before the body had even been taken to the infirmary. That evening, May opened the prison record system from an unused desk in the administrative wing. She searched for inmate deaths over the past 8 years. There were 17. At first, the number meant nothing. Then she began to read the names. One had been listed as an overdose in the kitchen storage area. One had fallen from a maintenance staircase. 2 had allegedly fought each other until one bled out. 7 had been declared suicides. 3 had died from medical complications that were never fully explained. And 3 had been transferred out of Black Ridge with no receiving facility recorded. The more May read, the more one detail appeared again and again. Every report had been signed by Warden Curtis Vale. Every report had been reviewed by the same internal medical officer. And every one of the dead men had spent time in Block D before they died. May closed the file and sat back slowly. For the first time since arriving at Black Ridge, she understood why the prison felt wrong. It was not because the inmates were dangerous. It was because someone had built an entire system around making danger look ordinary. And somewhere in segregation, behind a steel door and a silence that had lasted 4 years, Caleb Monroe was waiting. Not for rescue, not for revenge. For someone finally to start counting. May Doran did not sleep that night. She tried to tell herself that the files could still have innocent explanations. Prisons were ugly places. Men died in ugly ways. Records were often incomplete because nobody cared enough to make them complete. That was what she had been taught in training. There were policies, procedures, review boards, audits. There were always forms. And where there were forms, people liked to believe there was accountability. But the more May looked at the deaths connected to Block D, the less they resembled chaos. Chaos had no pattern. This did. At 2:14 in the morning, she opened the file of the first inmate on Caleb Monroe's list. His name was Darius Kemp. Official cause of death, accidental overdose. He had been found in a kitchen storage room with a plastic bag of pills near his body. The report stated that he had a long history of substance abuse and had become increasingly unstable in the days before his death. May read the report twice. Then she noticed something odd. Darius Kemp had been on medical restriction at the time. He had not been assigned kitchen duty. He had not been allowed near the storage room. And according to the movement logs, his cell door had never been opened that night. Someone had signed him out anyway. The signature belonged to Officer Jared Hume. May searched Hume's employment history. He had resigned 3 weeks after Kemp died. No explanation. No follow-up interview. No forwarding address in the personnel file. The second file was worse. A man named Wesley Grant had supposedly fallen from a maintenance platform while repairing a ceiling vent. The report said he had ignored safety instructions. Yet Wesley had been 61 years old, had severe arthritis in both knees, and had never worked maintenance a day in his life. His assignment was library cart duty. The photo attached to the incident report showed a smear of blood on the wall behind him, high above the floor. May had seen enough training photos to know what that meant. Wesley had not fallen first. He had been hit first. By sunrise, May had read 7 files. By breakfast, she had stopped trying to convince herself that Caleb Monroe might be wrong. The problem was that being right did not make him safe. It made him dangerous to the people who had buried those 17 names. And now May had become dangerous too. She spent the next day pretending nothing had changed. She followed orders. She checked cell doors. She carried her clipboard through Block D with the same stiff posture she had used since her first shift. She did not look at Caleb's empty place in the line during morning count. She did not ask about Mateo Ruiz. She did not mention the note. But every time she passed Warden Vale, she studied him more carefully. Curtis Vale was good at appearing ordinary. That was part of what made him frightening. He did not pace like a villain. He did not shout at officers. He did not carry himself like a man hiding secrets. He wore clean shirts, spoke in measured sentences, and remembered the names of staff members' children. He praised discipline. He talked about second chances. He visited church groups when they toured the prison. He had once received an award from the state for reducing violence inside Blackridge. May had seen the plaque in the lobby. Now she wondered how many bodies had been buried beneath it. Late that afternoon, Vale called her into his office. The room was neat in the deliberate way of a man who wanted people to believe he had nothing to hide. Framed certificates hung behind his desk. A small American flag stood near the window. On the shelf beside it sat a photograph of Vale, shaking hands with the governor, both men smiling as though the world outside the prison had no reason to fear what happened inside it. May stood in front of his desk while he studied a file. He asked whether she was settling in. She said she was. He asked whether Block D had been difficult. She said it was different from her last assignment. Vale smiled at that. He said Blackridge had a way of teaching people the difference between danger and drama. Most new officers, he explained, mistook inmate behavior for chaos. In reality, the prison ran best when everyone understood their place. Then he mentioned Caleb Monroe. He said Monroe was intelligent, educated, patient. The most dangerous kind of inmate, in Vale's opinion, was not the one who threw punches. It was the one who made other people doubt what they had seen. May listened carefully. Vale told her that Caleb had spent years manipulating staff through silence, that his refusal to speak was not discipline, but control, that young officers often projected nobility onto quiet men because they mistook restraint for innocence. Then Vale leaned back in his chair and said something that chilled her. He said Mateo Ruiz had made the same mistake. May kept her face blank. Vale continued. He said Mateo had become convinced Caleb was trying to help him. He said that when frightened people became desperate, they sometimes followed the wrong person. And when they realized they had trusted a monster, they broke. May wanted to ask him how he knew that. She wanted to ask why he had personally signed Mateo's report less than an hour after the body was found. Instead, she nodded once and said she understood. Vale dismissed her. As she turned toward the door, he added that she should be careful with records. He said Blackridge had a way of punishing people who spent too much time looking backward. May did not stop walking. But when the door closed behind her, she understood the warning for what it was. He knew someone had opened the files. He just did not know who. That night, May went to segregation. Officially, she was there to check the restraint log. Unofficially, she needed to see Caleb Monroe before Warden Vale found a reason to move him somewhere nobody could reach. Segregation sat beneath the older part of the prison, where the walls sweated in summer and the pipes groaned all winter. The cells were narrow, the lights never fully dimmed, and the air carried the stale smell of bleach, rust, and old fear. Caleb was sitting on the edge of his bunk when May arrived. His hands were cuffed in front of him. A bruise had darkened along the side of his jaw. His lower lip was split. Someone had hurt him after he was brought down there, and someone had made sure the report would say he resisted. May stood outside the door for several seconds. Caleb did not look up. Finally, she spoke quietly. She told him she had counted the missing. At that, his eyes lifted. They were not grateful. They were not relieved. They were tired. May told him she had found 17 deaths connected to Block D. She said the reports did not make sense. She said she believed Mateo had been murdered. Caleb watched her without moving. Then he looked toward the ceiling camera. May followed his eyes. The camera above the cell door was old and scratched, but the small red light was on. Caleb looked back at her. He pressed one finger against his lips. May understood. He would not speak. Not there. Not yet. She asked whether there was a way to communicate without being heard. Caleb looked down at the metal food tray beside him. Then he tapped it once with his cuffed hand. A short sound. He tapped again, twice. Then once more. May frowned. Caleb repeated the pattern. 1 tap. 2 taps. 1 tap. Then he pointed to the cell number painted beside his door. It's 121. May stared at the numbers. 1, 2, 1. She did not understand until he tapped the tray again. 1 tap. 2 taps. 1 tap. A code. Not letters exactly, not yet. Caleb watched her think. Then he lifted his fingers and made a small gesture near his chest. His index finger traced a shape in the air. Another gesture followed. Then another. May recognized it. Sign language. Not fluent, not enough for a conversation, but enough for a question. Who listens? Caleb's hands moved again. Not guards, not cameras. People. May stood very still. Then she remembered the men she had seen around the prison, who seemed almost invisible. The deaf inmate in the infirmary, who communicated with a correctional aide. The old man, who pushed the library cart and never looked anyone in the eye. The kitchen worker who had spent so long scrubbing floors that officers barely noticed him anymore. The men who swept corridors, repaired vents, collected laundry, cleared trays, washed dishes, and delivered supplies. The people nobody watched, because everyone assumed they had nothing to say. May looked at Caleb. He had not been alone. Not for 4 years. The next morning, she began noticing what Blackridge had trained her not to notice. In the laundry room, a young deaf inmate named Aaron Bell folded uniforms with perfect precision. He never spoke. Most officers treated him like furniture. But when May entered, Aaron glanced toward the security camera, then toward a stack of shirts marked for the night shift. He touched 2 fingers to his shoulder, then 3 to his wrist. May watched him repeat the movement. It was not random. Later, in the chow hall, an elderly inmate named Luther Webb placed trays on tables. His back was bent, and one hand shook from age. Nobody paid attention when he dropped a spoon. Nobody paid attention when he picked it up and tapped it against the floor twice before moving on. In the infirmary, a man named Felix Romero cleaned the hallways. He had a reputation for being slow and harmless. But when Officer Brigg passed him, Felix's eyes followed the man with a sharpness May had not expected. Officer Nolan Brigg was one of Vale's oldest staff members. He had been at Blackridge for nearly 15 years. He was broad-shouldered, heavy-faced, and always smelled faintly of mint gum. Most guards thought of him as dependable. He was the one who helped calm fights, the one who took extra shifts, the one Vale trusted to handle difficult inmates. But May had seen his name in 6 of the 17 death files. Every time it appeared, it was somewhere near the final movement log. A door opened. A prisoner transferred. A camera malfunctioned. A report signed. May started keeping notes. Not in the prison system, not on her phone. She bought a cheap notebook from the vending area outside the staff lot and hid it beneath the lining of her work bag. Every day, she wrote down names, times, gestures, and patterns. Aaron Bell, shoulder 2, wrist 3. Luther Webb, spoon taps 2 and 1. Felix Romero, watches Brigg, not Vale. Laundry uniform tags, irregular numbers. Block D deaths, all linked to Old City cases. The more she watched, the clearer the shape became. Caleb had built a network of witnesses inside Blackridge. Not with threats, not with promises, with attention. He had listened when no one else did. He had remembered people who had spent years being treated as disposable. And in return, they had become his eyes. 3 days after Mateo Ruiz died, Caleb was moved out of segregation and assigned to laundry detail. Officially, Warden Vale claimed that isolation had not improved his behavior. In reality, May suspected Vale wanted Caleb somewhere easier to control. The laundry room was below ground, far from visitors, far from administrative cameras, and full of loud industrial machines that could drown out almost anything. When Caleb arrived, Ronan Pike was already there. He stood near the steam press with 2 men from his crew, both larger than Caleb, and both wearing the blank expression of people who had learned to enjoy cruelty because it made them feel less afraid. Ronan smiled when Caleb entered. No one spoke. The guards at the door looked away. Caleb was handed a stack of uniforms and directed toward the far table. He worked without complaint, shirt after shirt, pants after pants, gray fabric, white name tags, blue thread, metal snaps. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Then Ronan's men began dropping soaked linens onto Caleb's table. Extra loads, heavy bags, blood-stained sheets from the infirmary, towels marked with brown water and chemical residue. Every few minutes, one of them bumped his shoulder or kicked the cart near his feet. Caleb ignored them. That was what Ronan hated most. He could not understand a man who refused to perform fear. Near noon, one of Ronan's men pushed a bundle of uniforms into Caleb's arms, hard enough to knock him backward. The bundle tore open. Shirts spilled across the floor. The guards laughed. Caleb bent down and began collecting them. As he did, he noticed something sewn into the inside collar of one shirt. A small red stitch, not part of the official tag. A deliberate mark. He turned the shirt over slowly. The name strip read, Officer Nolan Brigg. Caleb glanced toward Aaron Bell. Aaron was folding towels at the next station. Without lifting his head, he tapped his thumb against his wrist twice, then placed 3 fingers against his shoulder. 2, 3. May's notes. Shoulder 2, wrist 3. The code did not make sense until Caleb looked at the stitched number on Briggs' sleeve. B23. Block B, locker 23. The mark in the collar was not random. It was a map. Caleb folded the shirt carefully and placed it in the finished stack. Then he kept working. That evening, May received an unexpected assignment. She was told to inspect locker rooms in Block B because several officers had complained about missing personal items. It was the kind of task that sounded pointless, which made it perfect. She carried a clipboard, checked off numbers, and waited until the hallway emptied. Locker 23 belonged to Officer Nolan Brigg. It was locked. May tried the master key. It did not work. That alone was suspicious. Officer lockers were not supposed to have private locks, not unless an officer had installed one without authorization. May did not force it open. Not yet. Instead, she crouched near the bottom and examined the scratches around the frame. Fresh marks, a hinge recently removed and reattached. Someone had opened it from the side. She looked down the hall. No one was coming. Using the edge of a thin ruler from her clipboard, she slid it through the gap near the hinge and felt along the inside panel. Her fingers found something taped beneath the locker shelf. A small flash drive. May held it in her palm. For a second, she imagined taking it straight to the State Inspector General. She imagined calling an outside investigator. She imagined the relief of putting the evidence in the hands of people who could make arrests. Then she remembered Warden Vale's office. She remembered the governor's photograph. She remembered how quickly Mateo's death report had been finished. And she knew the truth. Whatever existed inside that flash drive had survived this long because nobody important had seen it. If she moved too early, it would disappear. She taped it back exactly where she found it. Then she walked away. That night, Caleb sat alone in his cell after laundry detail. His hands were sore. His shoulders ached. Ronan's men had spent the afternoon finding small ways to hurt him without leaving obvious marks. A knee against the ribs while passing a cart. A hot sheet dropped across his forearm. A shove into the metal edge of a folding table. Caleb had endured worse. Pain was simple. Silence was harder. He had not heard his sister's voice in 4 years. He had not seen his niece grow beyond the age of 6 in the photograph that lived inside his mind. Sometimes, in the dark, he tried to remember whether her front tooth had already fallen out before he went to prison. Sometimes, he imagined her walking into school with a backpack too big for her shoulders. Sometimes he wondered whether she still asked where Uncle Caleb was, or whether Naomi had learned to say his name less often because it hurt too much. The first year inside Blackridge, Caleb had received letters from Naomi every week. She wrote about ordinary things, grocery bills, her daughter's school play, the old apartment building where the elevator kept breaking. She wrote that she believed him. She wrote that she would never stop looking for a way to prove the truth. Then, one day, the letters stopped. At first, Caleb thought she was angry. Then he thought she had given up. Months later, Ronan Pike had walked past his cell and left a photograph on the floor. Naomi standing outside a pharmacy. Her daughter beside her. A dark sedan parked across the street. No message, no threat, just the photograph. Caleb understood. Warden Vale had reached beyond the prison walls. The silence was no longer a choice. It was ransom. The following morning, May found another folded note beneath the tray slot of Caleb's cell. She had not seen anyone place it there. The handwriting was not Caleb's. It said only this: "They move him Friday." May read it twice. Friday was 2 days away. She knew immediately what it meant. A transfer. Black Ridge used transfers the way other institutions used locked doors. A man sent away in the middle of the night could vanish into another system. His records could be delayed. His property could be misplaced. His visitors could be told nothing. If he arrived at the new prison at all, nobody would ask too many questions. May hurried to the assignment board. There it was. Caleb Monroe. Federal transport request. Friday, 11:40 p.m. Destination: Red Hollow Correctional Facility. May had heard of Red Hollow. Everyone had. It was 3 states away, isolated, overcrowded, and notorious for the kind of violence that never made the news unless someone important died. A man like Caleb would not last long there, especially if Warden Vale made sure the right people knew he was coming. May stood in front of the board, feeling the blood drain from her face. She had 2 days. 2 days to find proof strong enough to stop a transfer. 2 days to figure out what was inside Briggs' locker. 2 days before, Caleb Monroe became another missing name. And somewhere in Black Ridge, Ronan Pike was preparing for something bigger than a beating in the laundry room. Because men like Ronan did not waste effort on enemies they planned to kill quietly. They only made a spectacle when someone needed to be taught a lesson. By Thursday morning, the rumor had already spread through Block D. There was going to be a riot. Not a real riot, a controlled one. The kind that began with one fight, then another, then a locked door at the wrong time, and a guard who arrived too late. The kind that gave administrators a reason to move prisoners, destroy property, and blame the dead for everything. Caleb knew the pattern. He had seen it before, years ago, in police reports from other prisons. A disturbance created confusion. Confusion created missing minutes. And inside missing minutes, people died. At roll call, Ronan Pike stood 3 spaces away from Caleb. His face looked calm. Too calm. When Officer Doran passed, he made a small gesture near his waist, hidden from the guards. 1 finger down. Then 2. Then 3. Caleb saw it. Friday, 11:40. The transfer was not the plan. It was the cover. The riot would happen before the transport arrived. And by the time the doors opened again, Caleb Monroe would either be dead or blamed for setting the whole prison on fire. For the first time in 4 years, Caleb felt something close to fear. Not for himself, for the people who had trusted him. For Aaron Bell in the laundry room. For Luther Webb with his shaking hand. For Felix Romero, who cleaned blood from floors no one else wanted to see. For May Doran, who had stepped into a war she did not understand because she had chosen to count the dead. And for Naomi, somewhere outside the walls, still living under a threat Caleb had never been able to explain. Caleb closed his eyes for 1 brief moment. Then he opened them. The time for silence was almost over. But before he could speak, he would need to make sure the truth survived long enough to be heard. Friday arrived under a sky the color of dirty steel. From the outside, Black Ridge looked almost peaceful that morning. The watchtowers stood against the clouds. The razor wire glistened with rain. Delivery trucks rolled through the outer gate. Officers changed shifts with coffee in their hands and tired expressions on their faces. Nothing about the prison suggested that, by midnight, the truth buried inside its walls would be fighting to survive. But in Block D, everyone could feel it. The silence was different. It was no longer the ordinary silence of men protecting themselves. It was the silence that came before something planned, something rehearsed, something too large to stop with a simple order or a locked door. Ronan Pike spent the morning moving through the block with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what would happen next. He spoke little, but he did not need to. His crew had already received their instructions. A tray would be thrown in the chow hall. One man would start a fight. Another would pull the fire alarm. A third would jam a security gate. Once the officers rushed toward the noise, the cameras in the east corridor would fail for just long enough. Then Caleb Monroe would disappear. The official report would be written before sunrise. It would say he had organized the riot. It would say he had attacked staff. It would say officers had used necessary force. And somewhere, in a transport van that would never leave Blackridge, there would be no witness left alive to contradict it. Caleb knew all of this before the first tray hit the floor. He knew because Aaron Bell had passed him a towel in the laundry room that morning. Sewn into the corner, so small that no guard would notice it, was a sequence of marks. 3 stitches near the edge, 2 along the seam, 1 beneath the tag. 3, 2, 1. In their growing code, it meant one thing. They are ready. Caleb had spent the previous night thinking about every person Warden Vale could hurt if the plan succeeded. May Doran, Aaron, Luther, Felix. The men who had quietly helped him gather pieces of the truth. The people who had survived by becoming invisible. For 4 years, Caleb had believed silence was the only way to protect them. Now he understood something else. Silence could protect a person for only so long. Eventually, silence became the room where evil learned to speak freely. At noon, May Doran entered the staff locker corridor with a file folder under one arm and a borrowed maintenance key in her pocket. She had made her decision. She could not wait for the Inspector General. She could not wait for a judge, a warrant, or a supervisor who might already belong to Vale. Caleb was being moved that night. The riot was coming, and whatever was hidden in Officer Briggs' locker might be the only evidence strong enough to stop it. The hallway was empty. May stood in front of locker 23 and listened. Nothing. She tried the master key again. As before, it did not fit. Then she took out the thin maintenance tool she had hidden beneath her sleeve. It was not elegant. It was not official. But it was enough to remove the hinge pins one by one. Her hands shook as she worked. She thought of the warning in Vale's office. She thought of Mateo Ruiz hanging in his cell while strangers decided what his death meant. She thought of Caleb's note. Count the missing. When the final hinge pin came loose, May pulled the locker door forward. Inside, at first, there was nothing unusual. A spare uniform, a bottle of aspirin, an old pair of boots, a photograph of Brigg with his wife and 2 daughters at a lake. Then May pressed against the back panel. It moved. Behind it sat a sealed plastic case. Inside the case were 6 flash drives, a small digital recorder, and a stack of printed transfer forms bearing the names of prisoners who had officially died years earlier. May stared at the pages. Darius Kemp, Wesley Grant, Mateo Ruiz, and 14 others. There were also 3 names she had never seen in the death files because they had not been recorded as deaths at all. They had been listed as transfers. One of those names made her stop breathing. Arthur Bell. The witness Caleb Monroe had supposedly murdered 4 years earlier. May read the form again. Arthur Bell had entered Blackridge under a false inmate identification number 21 days after Caleb had been convicted. His name had been altered. His transfer had been sealed. His destination was listed as Internal Protective Custody. There was no release record, no death certificate, no medical file, nothing. But on the form, beside the date, was a handwritten note. Bell still talking. Move before review. May's knees nearly gave out. Arthur Bell had been alive. Caleb had not murdered him. The case against Caleb had not merely been false. It had been built on a lie so complete that the man they claimed was dead had been hidden inside the same prison where Caleb was sent to disappear. May grabbed the recorder. She pressed play. At first, there was only static. Then a man's voice emerged, weak and frightened. It was Arthur Bell. He was speaking quickly, as though he knew time was running out. He named companies. He named officers. He named payments that had passed through charities, construction firms, security contracts, and police accounts. He described how evidence was planted, how witnesses were pressured, how people who would not cooperate were moved into systems where no one outside could find them. Then he said a name May already knew. Curtis Vale. The recording ended with a sound like a door opening, then silence. May stood in the locker room with the recorder clenched in her hand. For 1 second, she imagined running, not from the truth. With it, out through the staff entrance, into her car, straight to the nearest state police office. But then she looked at the clock. 12:37 p.m. The riot was coming in less than 11 hours, and Caleb was still inside. She copied every file onto a second drive she had brought from home. Then she placed the originals back inside the case exactly as she had found them. The recorder, however, she kept. It was not enough to prove everything, but it was enough to begin. At 6:10 that evening, the first sign of trouble appeared in the chow hall. A metal tray crashed to the floor. Every head turned. A prisoner from Ronan Pike's crew stood over another inmate, shouting about stolen food. The argument lasted only seconds before a punch was thrown. Then another. Men surged backward from the tables. Guards rushed in. Chairs scraped across concrete. The fight was loud. Too loud. Too organized. Caleb sat at the far end of the room, watching the exits. He saw Ronan rise from his seat. He saw Officer Brigg move toward the east corridor. He saw the overhead lights flicker once. Then the fire alarm began to scream. Panic spread faster than violence. Men stood. Tables overturned. Guards shouted commands no one could hear. The east security gate slammed halfway shut and then froze. Smoke began to drift from a utility vent near the kitchen, thin at first, then darker. The riot had started exactly as planned, but Caleb had prepared for it too. Luther Webb, the old library worker everyone ignored, had spent the past 2 days moving books from one cart to another. Hidden inside the hollowed-out spine of an old legal textbook was a small brass key. It opened a storage door near the chapel corridor, a door no officer used anymore because the room behind it had been declared structurally unsafe. Felix Romero, the cleaner, had quietly removed the screws from a rusted vent cover beneath the chapel steps. Aaron Bell had sewn location codes into the laundry tags, and May Doran had left the chapel service entrance unlatched. It was not a perfect plan. It was not even a safe one. But it gave the weakest prisoners in Block D somewhere to go when the violence began. Caleb stood from his seat. For the first time, Ronan Pike looked directly at him with something more than contempt. He looked afraid. Ronan had expected Caleb to panic, to run, to fight, to become the monster Warden Vale needed him to be. Instead, Caleb began moving men toward the chapel corridor. Not his friends, not just the people who had helped him, anyone who was trapped. An older inmate with a cane, a young man shaking so hard he could barely stand. 2 prisoners from another unit who had no idea what was happening, a kitchen worker bleeding from the forehead. Caleb guided them through the smoke and noise with the same steady focus he had once used when he investigated scenes where everyone else had already decided the truth. Behind them, Ronan's crew began pushing toward the east gate. Officer Brigg shouted for Caleb to stop. Caleb did not. A guard grabbed his shoulder. Caleb twisted free, not with violence, but with the practiced movement of a man who understood balance and timing. The guard stumbled backward into the crowd. Caleb kept moving. Then Ronan Pike stepped into his path. For a moment, the chaos around them seemed to narrow. Smoke curled through the lights. Men shouted. The alarm screamed. Somewhere, glass broke. Ronan looked at Caleb with rage burning behind his eyes. He had waited 4 years to make Caleb react. Now, at last, he had his chance. Ronan swung first. The punch came hard and wild. Caleb stepped aside. Not dramatically. Not like a fighter showing off for a crowd. Just enough. Ronan's fist missed and struck the concrete wall. He cursed and turned again. This time, Caleb did not hit him. He caught Ronan's wrist, pulled him forward, and used Ronan's own momentum to force him off balance. Ronan fell against a table, knocking the breath from his lungs. Caleb leaned close enough for Ronan to hear him over the alarm. Then, after 4 years of silence, Caleb spoke. His voice was low, rough, and controlled. He told Ronan that fear only worked while people believed they were alone. Ronan froze. Caleb released him. Then he walked away. That was all. No brutal beating, no revenge, no show of strength. And somehow, that was worse for Ronan than any punch could have been. Because in that moment, The men around them saw that Caleb Monroe had never been afraid of him. The chapel corridor was already filling with prisoners when May arrived. Her uniform was stained with smoke. The recorder was hidden inside her vest. In one hand, she carried a ring of keys. In the other, a radio that had gone silent after someone cut the internal signal. She found Caleb near the old storage room. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then May held up the recorder. Caleb looked at it. His face changed. Not with surprise, with grief. He knew what it was before she said anything. Arthur Bell, alive after all, hidden in Blackridge, murdered after Caleb's conviction was secured. May told him they had proof. Not enough for every crime, maybe not enough for every name, but enough to bring outside investigators inside the prison. Enough to stop the transfer. Enough to destroy Vale's story. Caleb looked toward the smoke-filled hallway. Then he looked at the frightened prisoners gathered near the chapel door. He knew proof alone would not save them tonight. Vale still controlled the prison. And somewhere above them, the warden was waiting for the riot to become bloody enough that no one would question whatever happened next. May led Caleb through the chapel storage room. Behind a cracked wall panel was a narrow passage built decades earlier for maintenance access. It ran beneath the administrative wing and ended near the old records office. Most staff had forgotten it existed, but Caleb had not. Years before, when he first entered Blackridge, he had noticed the architecture. Old prisons told stories through their walls. Doors were moved, corridors were sealed. Rooms vanished from maps, but not from memory. At the end of the passage stood a steel door. Behind it was the abandoned records room. May unlocked it. Inside, dust covered the shelves. Broken monitors sat beneath plastic sheets. Old paper files filled boxes stacked to the ceiling. And in the far corner, hidden behind a cabinet, was a control panel linked to the prison's original public address system. The system had been disconnected from the main office years ago, but not completely. Caleb stared at it. May understood immediately. She placed the recorder beside him. Outside, the riot grew louder. A heavy impact shook the ceiling. Then the door behind them slammed shut. Ronan Pike stood on the other side. He had followed them. With him were Officer Brigg and 2 guards loyal to Vale. May reached for the keys. Too late. Brigg forced the door open. He looked at the recorder in May's hand, then at Caleb standing beside the old control panel. For the first time, Brigg's expression lost its calm. He knew. He knew the truth had survived. Brigg pulled his baton free. He told May to hand over the recorder. She refused. One of the guards grabbed her arm. Caleb stepped forward. Brigg swung the baton toward his ribs. Caleb raised his forearm, taking the strike. Pain flashed through him, but he stayed upright. Brigg swung again. This time, Caleb moved inside the arc of the weapon, caught Brigg's wrist, and drove his shoulder into the officer's chest. Brigg staggered backward into a shelf of old files. Papers burst into the air. The second guard rushed Caleb. Caleb turned, blocked the man's arm, and pushed him into the wall hard enough to knock the wind from him. The third guard hesitated. That hesitation was enough. May tore free, hit the emergency switch beside the panel, and the old public address system came alive with a burst of static. Every speaker in Blackridge crackled. The riot stopped for one breath. Caleb stood in the middle of the records room, his chest rising and falling, blood running from his forearm where the baton had struck him. For 4 years, he had refused to let Blackridge hear his voice. Now the entire prison was listening. At first, nothing came out. The silence stretched. Then Caleb spoke. He did not scream. He did not accuse. He began with a name, Darius Kemp. He gave the date of Darius's death, the cell number, the officer who signed the movement log. Then he said Wesley Grant, Mateo Ruiz, Arthur Bell. One by one, Caleb read the names of the 17 missing men. He read each name slowly. He gave the details no official report had wanted remembered. The times, the false transfers, the broken cameras, the officers present, the reports altered, the evidence hidden. Across Blackridge, men stopped fighting. Some stood frozen in corridors. Some lowered weapons they had picked up during the chaos. Some looked at the guards with new fear in their eyes. And in the administration wing, Warden Curtis Vale listened as his entire prison became a witness against him. May connected the recorder to the system. Arthur Bell's voice filled the speakers. Weak, frightened, undeniable. He named Vale. He named Brig. He named the network that had destroyed Caleb Monroe's life. Then the recording ended. For a moment, there was only static. Then another voice came through the radio on May's belt. State Emergency Response Team. They had received an automatic distress signal when the fire alarm system was triggered. May had also sent a scheduled evidence package to an outside journalist earlier that afternoon, using a delayed transmission she had set before the riot began. The files from Briggs' locker were already leaving Blackridge. Vale could no longer bury them. The warden's final mistake was believing he controlled every door. He did not know May had opened one before he ever tried to close it. Within minutes, state officers entered the prison through the emergency gate. The riot was contained not by force alone, but by the sudden collapse of the lie holding it together. Guards who had served Vale began stepping away from him. Some tried to deny everything. Some claimed they had only followed orders. A few looked relieved that the truth had finally arrived. Officer Brigg was arrested in the records room. The cuffs were placed on his wrists by men he had once supervised. Ronan Pike was found near the east corridor, sitting against the wall with his injured hand pressed to his chest. No one from his crew stood beside him. The men who had feared him for years had scattered when they realized the person they believed was powerless had outlasted him without becoming like him. Ronan looked up as Caleb passed. There was no victory in Caleb's face, only exhaustion. Ronan asked, almost too quietly to hear, why Caleb had not killed him when he had the chance. Caleb looked at him for a long moment. Then he said that men like Ronan spent their whole lives confusing fear with power, and Caleb was done teaching them the difference. By dawn, Blackridge looked like a different prison. The smoke had cleared. The broken tables were stacked against the walls. The alarms had fallen silent. Emergency lights cast pale stripes across corridors where men had spent years learning not to hope. Warden Curtis Vale was escorted out through the same front entrance he had used for press photos and state inspections. He wore handcuffs. Cameras waited outside the gate. Reporters shouted questions about the 17 deaths, the false transfer records, Arthur Bell, and the network of corruption tied to Blackridge. Vale did not answer. For once, he had nothing left to say. The investigation lasted months. More files were recovered. More recordings were found. Officers resigned. Contractors were questioned. Former inmates came forward. Families who had spent years accepting impossible explanations began receiving calls from investigators who finally wanted to hear what they knew. Caleb's conviction was reviewed first. The state did not apologize quickly. Systems rarely did. But the evidence was too clear to ignore. Arthur Bell had been alive after the date prosecutors claimed he was murdered. The witness statements against Caleb had been altered. The weapon evidence had been planted. The entire case had been built to silence an investigator who had uncovered too much. 6 months after the riot, Caleb Monroe walked out of Blackridge through the front gate. There were no cheering crowds, no music, no perfect moment waiting for him. His sister Naomi stood near the parking lot with tears in her eyes and both hands covering her mouth. Beside her was a girl Caleb barely recognized at first. His niece was 10 now. She was taller, older. Her face had changed in the years he had lost. For a second, Caleb could not move. Then she ran toward him, and when she wrapped her arms around him, the man who had survived Blackridge without speaking finally broke. He did not break loudly. He did not fall apart in front of cameras. He simply held her with both arms and cried into her hair, while Naomi stood beside them, crying too. Later, Caleb told Naomi why he had been silent. He told her about the photograph Ronan had left outside his cell, the threats, the fear that every word he spoke would somehow reach the people watching her from a distance. Naomi listened without interrupting. When he finished, she told him she had spent 4 years believing he had stopped trusting her. Caleb said he had never stopped. He had only been afraid that trusting anyone would get them hurt. It was not forgiveness all at once. It was not healing all at once. But it was the truth. And after years of lies, the truth was finally enough to begin. Caleb did not return to his old job. He could not. Too much of that world had been built around the same silence that had nearly destroyed him. Instead, he started something smaller. He called it the Roll Call Project. It began with a folding table, a borrowed office, and a list of 17 names. Caleb worked with legal aid groups, families of incarcerated people, former public defenders, and investigators who still believed a file could mean the difference between being forgotten and being found. The project helped families request records. It reviewed suspicious deaths. It trained advocates to recognize patterns that prisons preferred to call isolated incidents. It gave people a place to bring names that had been reduced to case numbers. Mae Doran testified during the trial against Vale and Brigg. She lost her job at Blackridge, at least for a while, but she did not regret it. Eventually, she joined a state oversight unit focused on prison conditions. She said she had entered corrections believing discipline kept people safe. Blackridge taught her that silence could be organized just as easily as violence. Aaron Bell was transferred to a facility with better services for deaf inmates. Luther Webb was granted compassionate release. Felix Romero was cleared in a separate review after evidence showed he had been framed years before for a crime committed by someone else. Ronan Pike remained in prison, but he no longer controlled Block D. The men who once followed him learned that fear was a fragile kind of currency. It bought obedience only until someone remembered they had a choice. And Caleb Monroe, the prisoner who had never spoken at roll call, became proof that a quiet person was not an empty person. Sometimes silence was not surrender. Sometimes it was a shield. Sometimes it was a promise made in the dark, held for as long as necessary. But there always came a moment when the truth had to be spoken. Not because speaking was easy. Not because the world had suddenly become fair. But because somewhere, someone was still waiting to be counted. And when that moment came for Caleb Monroe, he did not raise his voice to become powerful. He raised it so the forgotten could finally be heard. If you have ever been judged by a story someone else told about you, remember this. People may ignore your truth for a while, but truth has a patience that lies can never keep. And sometimes, the strongest thing a person can do is survive long enough to speak when it matters most.